Hello, good morning, and welcome to the American Indo-Pacific Forum's series of webinars on current and topics of global significance. I am Sivakumar Rajagopalan, one of the experts at the forum. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Saturday morning on the East Coast. We welcome all the global audience and our esteemed panelists. We are thrilled to have you here as our co-participants for our discussion on India-US strategic partnership, essential or not. Now, before we begin, I would like to give a short brief on who we are. American Indo-Pacific Forum is a group focused on strengthening American Indo-Pacific relationships and fabric in the background of quadrilateral security dialogues and cooperative strategies in multiple spheres such as global security, free and open Indo-Pacific, policy management, and more. The American Indo-Pacific Forum has evolved from the US-India Security Council and Forum that was instrumental in some landmark cooperative projects between the USA and India. We are spread across the US and have chapters in various states. As a group, we look forward to present the quickly evolving Indo-Pacific theater and challenges, solutions, and preparedness of the American Indo-Pacific Alliance in the region. Please stay tuned for more exciting news from us in the future by registering yourself on our website, which you will see in the banner below. Today, our webinar is for about 90 minutes. Please keep your microphones muted. We have with us 4 esteemed panelists who will present varied facets of the topic in their expert areas. After their remarks, the moderator will open the floor for questions and answers. Please do like, follow, share, and subscribe to our channels or videos on social media. Do make a note of your questions and type it out on the chat box as and when you have it. Try and limit your questions, keep it short and to the point. Because of paucity of time, the questions will be moderated. And now, let me have the pleasure of introducing you the moderator for the day, Dr. Swasti Rao. Dr. Swasti Rao is Associate Fellow at the Europe and Eurasia Center, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. An alumnus of JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, she has completed her PhD in Advanced International Politics from Tsukuba University, Japan. She is a recipient of the Japanese Education Ministry Fellowship, MX, in 2011, and also a recipient of the Okita Memorial Scholarship in 2010 from ICCR. She holds an adjunct position at the Tokai University. Her current research project at IDSA is on conflicts in Europe amidst shifting global power structures, geometries of deterrence in Europe, and its Indo-Pacific outreach as strategies for threat balancing. She has published with Routledge, World Scientific Publishers, and Palgrave Macmillan. She writes a fortnightly column in the print that discusses several aspects of the war and the European security order from an Indian perspective. She represented India at the flagship EU Security Dialogue, the Schuman Forum, held at the European Parliament at Brussels in March 2023. She has been identified as the geopolitical expert for the G20 by the government of UP in 2023. She has been assistant professor in the Department of Strategic and Security Studies, AMU, Aligarh Muslim University, where she taught courses on European security, rise of China, and implications for world order, research methodology, and UN peacekeeping. She's also the editor of Either or, an academic journal dedicated to international and political affairs. She is also featured on the editorial board of the annual yearbook, Department of Strategic and Security Studies at AMU. She has been lecturing the Indian Border Security Force commandants and the Indian Revenue Service officers on Ukraine war and its implications on European security and economics. Friends, welcome Dr. Swasti Rao. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shiv Kumarji, for that really kind introduction. And indeed, it is an honor today to moderate this wonderful session on a very important strategic partnership that is between India and the US. And I truly believe, and I've been doing it, by way of my work, by way of my lectures, by way of my articles, and a lot of other related work, that this indeed is going to shape the contours of where we are heading. So I think you have already done a very kind introduction. You've introduced the topic as well. So without further ado, I think I should be welcoming our wonderful panelists for the session today. So the first panelist for today is Professor Madhav Das Nalpat. He is India's one of the primary foremost professors of geopolitics. He's also the vice chair of the Manipal Advanced Research Group and UNESCO Peace Chair at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal University, India. Professor Nalpat is the philosopher and ideologue who has defined India's new nationalism since the 1980s. He believes and promotes India as a global power. He has been a gold medalist in economics from Bombay University, as editor of the Mathrubhumi Daily, and later as editor at the Times of India. He increased their respective circulations exponentially. He's the author of 7 books, the latest being Cold War 2.0, and this book has been brought out by Penguin in September 2023. So it's a forthcoming book which is coming very soon. His current positions include the editorial director of ITV Network, which includes NewsX and the Sunday Guardian India, where he presents 2 to 3 columns weekly. His revelations and opinions have frequently changed the course of events. He's very well known, and he's also known as somebody who truly inspires decision making, policy making in India. Professor Nalpat believes in a strong economy, a strong national defense, and a free secular society. He has condemned administrative and bureaucratic corruption. So, with that, let me have the honor of welcoming Professor Nalpat. So, now I'll go to the second one directly, right? Because Professor Nalpat would join. Is that right, Shiv Kumarji? Yeah, okay. Okay. Now, let me have the pleasure of inviting our second panelist for the day. That is Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan. He's a very decorated officer of the Indian Army. He's retired Lieutenant General from the Indian Army. And Lieutenant General Chauhan, was the chairman of the Ceasefire Monitoring Group in August of 2018. He was the Director General of Assam Rifles, that is India's oldest and largest paramilitary force. He has held several key appointments during his long career in the army. He has served at the apex level in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Home Counterinsurgency, Counterterrorism, Border Guarding, and Human Resource Management. He also has vast experience in military diplomacy since he was the defense attaché in the Indian Embassy in Nepal for 3.5 years, which is from 2004 to 2007. He's regularly been contributing articles and columns in various scholarly magazines and a constant invitee and participant and a speaker at seminars and leadership forums, including the IDSA, the place that I work, the Defense Services Staff College, the Army War College, the Officers Training Academy, the Armored Corps Center and School, the United Service Institute, the FICCI, the India Foundation, and the National Security Guard. What a pleasure to have you on board, Lieutenant General Chauhan. Now, may I welcome Mr. Arun Ayyagari, who is a foreign policy analyst. He's also a pilot and a political strategist. And it's wonderful that I'm introducing, Mr. Arun today because I actually met him, Mr. Arun, on a similar panel, I think, last year. So it's I would like to now invite him. He is an editor. He's a foreign policy analyst. Like I said, he's also a journalist. He's been a speechwriter. He is a speaker himself. He's a campaign consultant, a campaign manager. He's been a chief political strategist and also a talk show host. So he really dons many hats and with elan. He is a fellow at American Indo-Pacific Forum think tank in Washington, D.C., where Mr. Ayagari is also a certified substitute teacher in the state of New Jersey. And he teaches various advanced classes in US history, in social studies, in advanced math, in the middle school and high school, etc. What is special is that he also teaches rocket science and aerospace engineering to cadets in the US Air Force. He himself is an advanced pilot, he's a commercial pilot, he's a drone pilot, a ground instructor, and a first lieutenant in the United States Air Force Auxiliary, a graduate of South Brunswick and East Brunswick Citizen Police Academy. Mr. Ayagari completed his Master of Science in Electrical and Computer Engineering, Master of Arts, and he has a Master of Arts in Political Science and MBA. So I think he has all the right combinations for making today's discussion really interesting. So this was a brief profile of all our speakers for today. I am sure everybody has joined, and with this, I would like to begin, today's discussion. Just a few housekeeping announcements before I begin. So, what we are going to be doing today is that we are going to be having two rounds of discussions. I'm going to be inviting each one of you, starting from Professor Nalpat, to make your first intervention. And your interventions, please restrict yourself to the time, which is 5 minutes each. So once you make that intervention, we will go in for the round two. But first, let's look forward to having a discussion in the first round. And with this, let me first invite Professor Nalpat for making his intervention. The
Dr.
floor,
Swasti, sorry to
Nalpat,
interrupt.
yes.
Let us
Yeah,
welcome Dr. Anderson as well.
Oh
exactly.
yes. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. We also have with us Dr. Walter Anderson. Yes, of course. He is just my sincere apologies, but Mr. Dr. Walter Anderson, of course, I have read his work, and he's a political analyst, and he's an academic. He's an academic. He is a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He served as a senior adjunct professor of South Asia Studies, so he knows India really well. Dr. Anderson has served as the administrative director of the South Asia Studies program from 2012 to 2017, and as the Johns Hopkins University representative to the American Institute of Indian Studies. And prior to joining the John Hopkins, Dr. Anderson served as chief of the U.S. State Department's South Asia Division in the Office of Analysis for the Near East and South Asia. He has held other key positions within the State Department, which includes being special assistant to the ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, and he's been a member of the policy planning staff in Washington, D.C. He's been a member of US Foreign Service at Moscow and Pakistan as well. So obviously these two regions really interest India a lot. He previously has also taught at the undergraduate program at the University of Chicago. He has taught at the College of Worcester, which is Worcester, Ohio. He has also taught at the Allahabad University in India. Of course, he has taught at Johns Hopkins University graduate program, and he has taught at Tongji University in Shanghai, which was a graduate studies program. And Dr. Anderson's current research involves Hindu nationalism and India's assertive foreign policy in the Indian Ocean and its littoral. He has published widely. Of course, I myself has read, his works, but his other publications include the Brotherhood in Saffron, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and Hindu Revivalism, a view to the inside, and a forthcoming book on Hindu nationalism. So he's credited with numerous articles in academic journals in the US and India as well, and in the press. So I'm very happy to welcome all four of you, extremely distinguished panel for today. And like I said, that we should now start the first round of your interventions, and I will start, and we will follow this particular order, and we will start with Professor Nalpat. So, Professor Nalpat, could you please unmute yourself while one speaker is speaking? Please, the rest of you should be muted to avoid any disturbance. And Professor Nalpat, I will now have you go. So, could you please make your first? Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Shweta, and thank you very much for having invited me to the show. And Walter actually was kind enough to write an introduction to my previous book, which came out in April, Geopolitics of the 21st Century, a compendium of writings. And before that, in August of last year, there was a book called 75 Years of Indian Foreign Policy by Rupa. And in that book, I had pointed to the necessity almost of India and the United States coming together. That did excite a certain amount of controversy. Remember, this was August 2022, not August 2023. And there were, some comments made that why was I being so partial to the United States and to the Americans? Well, that the book was basically about Indian foreign policy over 75 years, its successes, its failures, and what needed to be done. And after that, there's a new book which is going to come out by around September. You'll see it in the book stands. It's called Cold War 2.0. Uh, and the reason for writing this was essentially to show why an India US alliance, why a foreign policy symbiosis between India, the United States, democracies, and some other countries is essential. It is in the context of Cold War 2.0, which is now going on across the world. We all have seen the Cold War 1.0, mainly between the US and the USSR. And we didn't really realize it. It basically tiptoed in on us and it became more manifest after COVID. But the reality is that there is a new Cold War now. And some of us, for some years, have been calling it Cold War 2.0, again, to a certain amount of criticism by various other friends and colleagues, and I accept all that. But the reality is actually that today you have a China where you have the Communist Party led by General Secretary Xi Jinping that is clearly out to assert its primacy in the global order. And the first, the Eurasian continent, well, as far as the Eurasian continent is concerned, a case can be made that as a consequence of the Sino-Russian alliance, that a large part of the Chinese design in the Eurasian continent has already been met. And of course, the point is there is tension between Russia and China in Central Asia, for example, where India is concerned, for example, in Africa, for example. But I don't think the Russians have much of an option except to ensure that they are closely linked to China, and that's what's happening. There's another alliance which I have been talking about for several years now, which is the Sino-Wahhabi alliance. And I'd like to point out very clearly, I do not mean Wahhabis as a community, but as an extremist strain of a great faith. And may I point out that my own mother converted to that faith. And we in the family were perfectly happy with that because, after all, for me, Amma was my Amma, my mother. It didn't matter what faith she belonged to. And the reality is that there is an extremist fringe in every faith, every single faith, whatever faith you talk about. And Wahhabism is an extremist fringe of a particular faith that sought to basically swallow up their entire faith, acting in the name of the faith. Now, Saudi Arabia was the epicenter of that effort, and Mohammed bin Salman has basically, turned Saudi Arabian policy on its head by being the first Al Saud to acknowledge that Wahhabism is not desirable at all, which is why I've had a soft corner in my writings for him, again, to a lot of criticism. But if you look at the bigger picture, the fact that he is opposed Wahhabism, and that too being an Al Saud, and that too being the Crown Prince, is important. The fact is, we are in a new Cold War 2.0. And the way I look at it, and Swati, I'm not going to take more than a minute more, we are poised in a situation very similar to what was the case in the late 1920s and early 1930s in the previous century in Europe. Only this time, the geopolitical pivot is in Asia. It's not the Atlantic, it's the Indo-Pacific. It's no longer Germany, it's a much bigger country to the north of India, and that country is China. And what I'm looking at is to have an alliance of deterrence. I'm not looking for war. I've been a UNESCO Peace Chair since early 1999, and I'm proud of that. I'm still a UNESCO Peace Chair. I believe strongly that peace needs sometimes a very strong deterrent force to ensure that war does not break out accidentally or through overconfidence or through a misreading of the adversary. And that is why I have been a strong supporter of the Quad. I've been a very strong supporter of an Indo-US strategic alliance. It's not because of any particular affinity to the United States. It's an affinity to the interests of my country, India, and its 1.4 billion people. Joe Biden, his Democratic Party, well, there are many points on which they have expressed themselves pretty negatively, where India and Indian policies and certain Indian parties are concerned. But you saw the warmth between him and Prime Minister Modi. And may I end by saying that warmth is the warmth of a necessary friendship. In India, we have, my own marriage was a love marriage, and thank God it's endured for 38 years because the patience of my wife, and I look forward to the enduring for our lifetimes. But having said that, a lot of love marriages end much quicker than arranged marriages. Arranged marriages are arranged on the basis of interests, fundamental interests, whereas love marriages can be arranged on the basis of sometimes superficial and peripheral issues. Our relationship, India and the US, is what I may call an arranged marriage. It's on the basis of deep rooted fundamental consanguinity of interest, synchronicity of interest. Walter and I have known each other for decades, and he knows my views on all this. The reality is that the time has definitely come for an India US strategic alliance, for in the basically not to provoke a war, but to deter a war by showing the cost of that war to any country that believes it can unilaterally change the status quo, whether in the Eurasian continent or in the Indo Pacific or thereafter elsewhere in the world. That's where we are poised. That's exactly why I wrote the first book, which came last August in Rupa about Indian foreign policy, what it was, what it should be, and why I've written this book. And it's being published by Penguin. It will be out in the bookstores in September. I've written this basically to give an exposition of why I believe it's an inevitability that there should be a strong India US strategic alliance. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Nalpat. I think you made extremely important points. And one of the things that I also keep highlighting through my work is that, what happened in Ukraine really makes things very complicated for us if the same were to happen in the Indo-Pacific, in the Straits. And it is important to understand how the security of Ukraine in some way is also connected with the security in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'm also glad, you brought up the deep state interest that drives the India-US partnership today, which is basically based on convergence of our interests. Now, without losing any time, I would now invite Lieutenant General Shokeen Chauhan. Sir, the floor is now yours, and please make your intervention for the first 5 minutes, based on which we are going to have a later discussion. So I'm going to mute myself. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Narapat. Very, very strong opening statement. I'm a soldier, so as a soldier, I have very different take on certain issues. But I must firstly give you my experience of when I was going to the United States as a as a member of the US India military strategic talks that was held for the first time in 2011, and I was the co-chair from the Indian side. And I remember entering the US at Chicago. The talks were scheduled to be at the Pacific Command in Hawaii. And the first thing the customs officer there asked me was, what can the US learn from the Indian military? Or what can the Indian military learn from the US? So this is something that actually we need to talk about, we need to discuss, because within our nations there is a huge space of uh, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean that separates us actually geographically. But as Professor Nalapat said, geography is now actually, has brought us together again. Reticence and reluctance are actually two words that apply most to the Indian US relationship that is now emerging as a strategic partnership. As large democracies, large militaries, our togetherness is something that will hold the democratic world together. There's no doubt in my mind. But yet, our relationship has not been easy, actually. We've been pummeled by changing dynamics of the world order, the pattern, expectations, structure, gravity of threats, and most importantly, the assessed timeline of the future are also dynamic today that it's almost impossible to have a common perception on these. So there are actually great changes in the way the US and the and India think of most issues. But recently, the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Washington, has changed the thought processes both within the bureaucracies and the political structures of our country. We always have been of the opinion that the US is trying to balance us with Pakistan. And today, the US strategic approach towards India is based on the perception that India will be a foil against China in a fast rising competition between the world's two most powerful nations. I am aware that the US has shown immense patience in developing this relationship and taking it to the level of a strategic partnership. I recall very early, I was a young major at that time, the 1991 kick lighter proposals and the 1992 commencement of exercise Malabar. These were two beginnings. And actually, slightly later, when I was serving in the army headquarters, we had the first exchange of experts between India and the US. India was at that time fighting a war in Kashmir with Pakistan. Pakistan had unleashed a huge amount of terrorists inside, and we were going to great lengths to explain to the US that these terrorists were actually not local Kashmiris. And at that time, the US just refused to accept. So actually, it was during one of the visits of the US military that I was chartered to interact with that I brought a Pakistani terrorist whom we had caught and introduced him to the US military to say that, look, here is one guy we've caught. And please believe us when we say that these are Pakistanis and not indigenous Kashmiris who are inside Kashmir. So we've had our differences, we've had our problems, we've had our discussions, we've had hesitation between us. But today, as China looms, the threat of China looms onto the free world, onto the democratic world. India will have to accept the fact that we are going to be a bulwark. We are going to be, we are going to hold China in the Himalayas. She will not be able to expand, and we will need the US's help for that. And the US is also aware that she needs India's help in the Indo-Pacific region. And it's important for both of us to understand that we need each other. And this need that we have, we both of us have, must transform into a sensible strategic alliance between India and the US. India's reticence and reluctance in the early years may be blamed actually for cementing the Indo-US relationship. But we simply did not believe that the US would change transformationally, and therefore much of the time that we sort of pushed this away was because of the fact that we were not willing to believe the change of the US's perception towards us. It is we have been actually, much that the US feels probably. India has never been naive about our security needs, but over the last couple of years, especially since Galwan and that terrible that terrible interaction that we had with the Chinese, our concerns have now turned into something that's extremely important, and we are now quite clear, at least in the military, at the strategic level, that we need the US, we need the technology that the US has, we need the weight of US's power, we need a backing, and we need to be clear that we can't fight this alone. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Chauhan. I think you made a very important point, and I think it is really important that earlier that we were using Russia to balance China, and that option is really, I would say, appended because of what is happening in the world. And I keep arguing myself that regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the point is that Russia is going to get further pushed with China, which is really significantly going to affect India's strategic options in the region. And therefore, we need to balance it much more vigorously in the Indo-Pacific with the kind of relationship that we are discussing today. I'm also glad you brought out the trust factor, which has been a sticky wicket between India and the US, and how that particular perception is changing. And I guess it's a welcome change, of course. Now let me go and invite our third speaker for the day, Mr. Arun Ayyagari, and looking forward to hearing your remarks, Arun. Please time yourself for 5 minutes first, and then we take it forward. Thank you.
All right, can you guys hear me? Good. So the good thing is there's always two good things about being part of a forum. One, you get the best gracious introductions ever about yourself, so it feels good. And two, you get to meet very accomplished fellow participants, just like today, right? Very honored to be part of the AIPF webinar and my fellow participants. Since I'm both a soldier and a political analyst, so I'll start with the politics. I always say there's three types of ticks. One is politics, two, geopolitics, and three, optics. That's all there is to any international or foreign event. For example, since the title of our conversation talks about latest visit of Modi, I'll quickly touch upon that just for 30 seconds in this context. When Mr. Modi visited US last month, I think the last week of June, the optics was all the fanfare surrounding Modi, right? A lot of media, a lot of press coverage, that's all the optics. The politics is Joe Biden, the president of the United States, he needed to attract the Indian voter base. That's the politics of it. And it applies to the Indian counterpart as well. And then the geopolitics is about furthering bilateral relations in a mutually beneficial way. Now, at a very high level, since I'm also an instructor and a teacher, I would like to follow that path. I would like to break down the US-India relations into 4 time periods, and I will grade them, right? I'm going to grade the relations. Starting from independence, which is 1947 to 1971, that's from Truman administration to Nixon administration, I would give it a D as in Delta. 1971 to 1973, apparently, it's F minus. When Nixon administration was in the US and Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India, I think that tumultuous time period, 1971, at the time of Bangladesh war, I think that was when the bilateral relations were at their worst. There's also some name calling apparently involved, if anybody read the Nixon tapes. Then again, from 1973 to 1991, which is when India started liberalization, privatization, globalization through the Nixon, George H.W. Bush era. I would probably give it a C, as in Charlie. I'm sorry, I'm a military guy, so I follow the the military alphabets, so phonetic alphabets. From 1991, which is when PM Narendra Modi was the Prime Minister of India, to present, which is through Clinton administration, Bush, George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump. It moved gradually from B to currently, I would probably give it an A+. So if you look at these in the hindsight, if you look at all in retrospect, if you look at all the time periods, trust, I think, is a key word. I think that's a key word which is driving the US-India relations. And I'll tell you why trust is such an important word, because India got a lot of exceptions from the United States. That also shows a special bonding, I should say. First of all, nuclear power. Although India did not sign the NPT or the CTBT, it still gets access to the nuclear fuel. CAATSA sanctions. We could still take fuel from Russia, despite India could still take fuel from Russia, despite CAATSA sanctions by the United States. Technology transfer of jet engines. We saw that when Modi visited US last month. Oil. India is still able to import oil from Russia, despite the Nord Stream pipeline and other sanctions of Russia. So that also goes to say that the United States over time has authenticated the independence in nature of foreign policy of India. United States understood that India cannot be tied to any bilateral relations of other countries in the world. India, just like any other sovereign nation, is entitled to its own independence of her own foreign policy. And the other change I noticed gradually over a period of time is the projection of soft power. Mr. Narendra Modi, this is something new, I should say. It sounds comical, but it's new. Narendra Modi started this whole concept of what I call hug diplomacy. If you notice Narendra Modi's personality, because also trained candidates running for office in the United States, so I trained them on how to talk and what to speak and things of that nature, on demeanor. So Mr. Modi, he hugs his counterpart. Anytime he visits a country, that could be Australian Prime Minister, we saw that, it could be Joe Biden, it could be a president of any nation. He receives them with a warm hug. And guess what that does? That automatically forces the other person subconsciously to reciprocate that with another hug. The reason why I'm focusing on these minor aspects are this also lays a foundation for the future relations. We've seen that. We've seen it's not just the stance of a nation, it's also how the head of a state feels about the other nation, how the ambassador to that state feels about the other nation, right? How the ambassador to the United Nations from that country feels about the other nation. We've seen that from the history, which actually cemented the relations between US and India. So these things matter. This all come under soft power. Also, what Mr. Narendra Modi does is he uses soft power from other aspects as well. For example, commonality in religion. For example, Buddhism, right? So he's trying to use the Buddhism circuit across the South nations, South Asian states, which share similar heritage. For example, in Nepal, India, Tibet, they all share that. So anytime there is an opportunity, there is a projection of soft power. These are other important aspects which help the relations between states grow. This is actually even more important in a changing global polarity. There used to be, the world used to be bipolar. In the past decade or two, we're seeing that thanks to territorial aggression, maritime aggression of other states vis-a-vis China, we've seen that the nature of relations is changing. The world order is changing from bipolar to a multipolar world. In other words, at the expense of offending others, I should say India, I think, has placed herself very well in Asia Pacific, that it would be called as America of the Asia Pacific. It achieved that through soft power and through nurturing bilateral relations with other states as well. We've seen that regardless of this geographical size of the state, for example, Papua New Guinea, Modi, in fact, even the United States, gives them the same importance. So that puts them at a higher pedestal. Also, another thing I should mention. Why is United States, like I mentioned before, has given special attention to India? There are several reasons why this happens. Because firstly, the Indian American population in the United States is growing. Obviously, that comes with the promise of ties between United States and India. And now India is the world's most populous nation. Second, there's India's attractiveness as an economic market and as a military buyer as well. Third, there's India's geography in Asia. Not to mention, there's a common adversary in the form of China between the United States and India. So United States would strategically like to use India's presence in Asia Pacific to counter China. Fourth, both Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi acknowledge the Indo-American diaspora that has distinguished itself as a professional, law-abiding, prosperous, and unproblematic community, and is the biggest votary of better India-US ties. And we've seen the role the diaspora has played in, I think one of the speakers had alluded to that, the role the Indian diaspora has played in bringing the civil nuclear deal to fruition in 2008. So I would like to just state one fact, and I'll finish my opening statements. As of June 2023, which is last month, United States is the largest trading partner of India. And surprisingly, the dichotomy is China, given all the attention it's getting, China is the second largest trading partner with India. So as we can see, all the other geopolitical rivalries aside, the trade and economy sometimes is independent of the foreign policy views of the nations involved. So there are other challenges I would like to talk about, but since I've been a moderator myself in the past, so I'm very sensitive to time. So I would try not to exceed my 5 minutes. So yeah, I'll talk about challenges later, but I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun, for your intervention. And I think, we would definitely, as we go ahead, we would like to have more discussions on this entire understanding of how just by having enough trade, you still cannot rule out the possibility of conflict. I mean, we saw that happening in Russia. Europe was completely dependent on Russia, was having the best of its trade, and yet the Ukraine war happened. We saw that in Galvan. So one of the things that I think everybody now agrees to is that trade will slowly become more and more strategic, and it is an irreversible trend. It will take time, so the decoupling is not going to work right away. The de-risking has to be understood better. It will go on slowly and steadily. But that was a very important point that you made, and we'll take it up further. With this, let me now welcome and also introduce, Dr. Walter Anderson for his remarks, and eagerly looking forward to hearing your remarks, sir. So you have 5 minutes out there to make your first intervention, and then we'll move on to the second one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Mr. Rajagopalan and Ms. Rao for organizing a discussion on what is a very important issue for our two countries, in fact, the world, to look at, and that is the larger Indian Ocean issue and the challenges that both of our countries face today. In this 5 minutes, I want to sort of look at the U.S. approach to India. What does the U.S. think of India? And the second one, if possible, I'd like to sort of talk about what the U.S. can do to strengthen India. And I should keep in mind, for those who have been watching polls in the U.S., India comes near the top of foreign countries which Americans feel a sympathy for. And in the U.S. Congress, there is strong U.S. support, as was reflected in Prime Minister Modi's visit to the U.S. Several weeks ago. And when he addressed the joint session of Congress, and if you have a chance, go to YouTube and watch that, and watch the reaction of both sides of the aisle. In the United States, it's somewhat rare that they both stood up and cheered at the prospect of an improved U.S.-India relationship. And I think that is, as other people here have mentioned, that's a very likely possibility given the common threat from China. I want to start out with an issue that one of our, Mr. Iyengar, brought up in his talk, and that was the nuclear deal that was signed in 2008. I was in the United States. I was in India at the U.S. Embassy in the early 1990s when the move began to shift to a more stable relationship with India. And it had a lot to do with then a rising China, though the true implications of that were several years away before it became the case. But what the U.S. began to do was, for those who have followed U.S.-India relations in the early 1990s, began to put into place a series of measures that would improve what had been a rocky relationship with India by the U.S. ever since its independence in 1947. Those efforts in the 90s led to talks 2005, 2008, leading to the nuclear deal that provided for a resumption of U.S. nuclear fuel and technology to India's civilian nuclear facilities after 3 decades of blocking such trade. And India, in its turn, agreed to IAEA international safeguards on its civilian facilities. Now, what's most interesting about this nuclear deal was its geostrategic implications. The deal signaled the U.S. goal of forging a stronger relationship with India that would be in a better position to constrain a rising and assertive China. Even though that deal did not involve, as several of our speakers have mentioned already, a treaty relationship with India, and it's something that we have sort of lived with for a while. And it's one of the misfortunes of getting older is we all pass away. And a person who recently died, some of you know the name, at least know the person, is Tom Thornton, who played a significant role in getting the U.S. to move closer to India. Well, that was very difficult in many ways. The U.S. concern and Indian concern with an assertive and rising China remains the key guiding principle, though not the only one, behind a increased U.S.-India security ties. India today, in my view, is the key actor in Asia in maintaining a stable Indo-Pacific region, as was clearly demonstrated by President Biden in his welcoming to Prime Minister Modi. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, demography. India is now the world's most populous country with 1.4 billion people. That's growing. The Chinese population, in fact, may be diminishing. What India requires is an educational system that it can employ its young people productively. And there's a lot of interesting thinking going on about that. The second is India is the world's fastest growing economy among the large economies of the world at 6.5% to 7%. And predictions are that it will stay at about that level for the next few years. India, keep this in mind, India has moved from the 10th largest, 11th largest country to the 5th largest this year, and it's likely to move past Germany and Japan over the next few years to be number 3. And finally, geography. Where India is located in the middle of the Indian Ocean and juts down a massive peninsula about 1,500 miles, has long made it a source of interest for anybody concerned with the strategic issues of the Indian Ocean, and that, of course, includes the U.S. today. The Chinese threat to the Indian Ocean area and to India has not diminished over the past 3 decades. If anything, a stronger China economically and politically makes the Chinese quest to resurrect the idea of the Central Kingdom one recognized by its neighbors, a more important consideration. And that shows up in a couple of things. One is the Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. The Chinese have virtually declared all of the South China Sea within what they call the 9-dot line, and that overlaps with with claims of neighboring countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam. Then, of course, the issue that has been very important to India is the dispute along the long Himalayan frontier, including actual fighting on the frontier between India and China. Then there's a military presence of China around Taiwan and some of the Japanese islands that reach down from the mainland islands of Japan. And then there's an effort to punish Australia for its criticism of China's handling of the COVID crisis. Now, these steps have produced a backlash, such as the four-nation Quad, Australia, Japan, US, and India, which partly involves security cooperation. Then there is the relationship of Australia, US, and UK, AUKUS, which has an exclusive military dimension. Then there's higher GDP outlay for military, Japan, Korea, and India. Maybe we want to get into that because I think that's an important consideration in development. Yet there's also a certain caution among many of the nations of Asia about offending China, given the economic power and military power of China. And I think that's where it requires a presence of someone like, or a country like the US, to provide a certain strength and reality to a issue of China asserting itself in the Asian region. Now, these shared strategic objectives among several of China's neighbors do not mean they support a security treaty resembling NATO. And India, as some of our speakers here have already said, is not likely to sign such a treaty, though there is certainly a tilt, which we may want to get into that. While our countries tilt somewhat towards each other, there still remain several key differences between them. One is the military rule in Myanmar, the theocratic regime in Iran, open criticism of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and growing purchases of Russian energy. But the issue of China is by far the most important issue, and makes these other questions that can deal with. The US and all countries that have relations with each other have points of difference. The US and Canada have points of difference, and we do. And the differences we have with India, are not nearly as significant as to undermine the issue of China, where the US, is in many ways working with India to build up India's strength. And I'll go into that later if I have time, because I think I'm running out of my time. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Anderson. It was really wonderful listening to you. And I think with this, we have come to an end of the first round of discussion. I think several important factors were raised. In my opinion, I would, as we go ahead in the second round, I think we would have more crystallized discussions on certain things. Of course, there is a rise of multipolarity, and the rise of multipolarity has also sort of, brought about this entire discourse on what is meant by friendshoring and what is meant by, a different kind of strategic, so to say, options that the US is also sort of playing with. Because how do you then sort of, turn the multipolar world order into a win-win situation for the US and not really look at it as a zero-sum game. So I think that's important. We would like to hear more on that. Definitely, I think in the India-US equation, there has been a respect for India's strategic autonomy. Arun has also mentioned how there were exemptions from CAATSA sanctions India has received. India has also been allowed to go on with its oil trade despite the G7 oil ban. That is an area that I work on, so I definitely know what kind of a situation that was, and how India really actually landed up helping the G7 price cap agenda by buying more oil from Russia, that allowed for the Russian oil to reroute, etc. What I think is that I think both sides understand that India's template of forming these relationships does not operate by the logic of forming alliances. India still rejects the alliance worldview, but what we have with the US for sure, and there's another actor with whom we have similar strategic partnership in Europe, which is France. So of course we keep talking about the template that India has with respect to the US and with respect to France, where we don't really get into any alliance building, any signing of treaties or security treaties, which is India considers it something which was belonging to the old day and age. But where India is today, what makes more sense is to have, what we are having today, like a really deep strategic partnership, which is based on mutual trust and which is also forward looking. What I would like to mention here is that I think the nature of Indo-Pacific is key to understanding how this relationship is going to evolve, because compared to or in contrast to the Euro-Atlantic Security Order, or that security theater, which definitely has a very clear-cut, crystallized, security architecture, which is called the NATO. Indo-Pacific does not have a permanent security architecture. So therefore, what you have in Indo-Pacific is a different kind of, alliance building, of groupings, which are sometimes very fluid in nature. You have the framework of trilaterals. You have the framework, the intelligence sharing is happening in a different way. It is a maritime space particularly. So there's so much on maritime domain awareness, etc., etc. So I think all these things kind of make it very interesting. And as we go on to the second part, and I was just sort of going through all the remarks that have been made today. I think, Professor Nalpat, I would, you are free to sort of focus on something that you would like to focus on for the second round and for the other 5 minutes that you would now get. I would like, if you could throw some more light on what is your understanding on how the rise of, for example, in the Eurasian order, how does the options that India now doesn't have, with Russia being pushed with China, how will that play out in India's relationship in the Indo-Pacific? I know it is imperative, it is pretty obvious, but I would really like to see how you have sort of worked that out, because that is a very, very important key, so to say, dynamic which is unfolding there. So I think that is something that I would probably like to know more. And the second thing that I'd like to know more from Professor Nalpat is the Sino-Wahhabi alliance. I think we don't talk about that too much, and we're usually only talking about the Sino-Russian alliance and how does that impact India. I would like to know that. It is also very key to understanding our security in Afghanistan. That's another security complex that region that we struggle with so much. So I think if you could throw some more light on that, any work that you may have done, some key takeaways of how the Sino-Wahhabi alliance is going to impact India's strategic options in the region, etc. I think it would be very useful. So as you end, probably we'll then go on to the next speaker. But first to you, and these are my two specific questions to you, but you are also free to make your own elaborations. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Sophie, I'd like to point out that when we talk about China, we are not referring to the Chinese people. In my view, a Chinese Communist Party member is very different culturally and civilizationally from a non-party member, even in the PRC.
Very well.
Secondly, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is very different from ordinary members of the Chinese Communist Party. And thirdly, the top leadership is extremely different from even the middle and the upper ranks of the leadership. So we are talking different populations here. I have amazing respect for Chinese people. I've gone there multiple times, and I have, when you go across Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, United States, you've got a wonderful Chinese diaspora there. And the difficulty that they have been facing is the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping expects every every ethnic Han to be loyal to the PRC, which basically means loyal to the Communist Party, or rather its leadership. And this was not a problem when the old Cold War was going on, when it was between the USSR and the US. But it is a severe problem when you are ethnic Chinese and you have relatives in China, and they are, basically telling you on your visits there or in other ways when you meet them in third countries, sometimes even in the US, you got to do this, you got to do that, and you're plainly flouting the law of the country whose passport you hold. So that is a severe problem that is being faced by ethnic Chinese, and many of them are, I'm happy to say, moving away from this fascination with China, this identification of China with communist China. The Chinese nation is not the Communist Chinese Party and its membership at all. Just as I said, the Wahhabis are not to be identified with the Muslim community, which is a wonderful community, and if I may say so, a community that has contributed very much across the world and certainly in India. The second point is, of course, you were talking about Russia. I would like to see a strong, robust India-Russia relationship, and that's important for Russia as a lever with China, quite frankly. If you didn't have the India relationship, Russia would have to cut far more, if I may say so, slack in that sense for China, and be very much more in China's grip than it is today. What degrees of freedom it has, in a significant way, it's also because of the close relationship it has maintained with India. I saw this during Galwan, where not even for 24 hours did the Russians cease their security relationship with us, even when Indian and Chinese troops were confronting each other on the border. And I'd like to point out, therefore, that relationship is a rock solid relationship, but we can understand why the United States is not like Russia. It took me a long time. I'm not the smartest guy, anywhere. But I realized that the Americans are smart and they know the only country that can displace the United States as the primary power in Europe, the primary influence in Europe, is Russia. So kneecapping Russia is an absolute priority for the United States. And you have this Ukraine war, which was driven by Biden and by Boris Johnson, poor fellow. He thought by jumping on that bandwagon and by really upping the ante, he can escape being removed from office. Poor chap didn't succeed in that. I don't know if Joe Biden will succeed. But the same thing with China and India. It took some of us a long while to realize that the only country that, frankly, can displace China in primacy in Asia is India. So the Chinese Communist Party, and again, like I say, when I say China, I mean the Chinese Communist Party. I don't mean the Chinese people at all. I don't mean China as a nation. The Chinese Communist Party will try and kneecap India wherever it can. And this is what has been happening to us for a long period of time. It's been happening in a fairly open way. The good thing about Xi Jinping, he's very transparent. Previous Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Mao was transparent, very transparent. And despite that transparency, some of our people who are in power in India didn't quite get the message. But fortunately, the Indian government under Prime Minister Modi has got that message. May I remind you, it is Modi who signed the 3 foundation agreements with the United States. All 3 have been signed. They're the foundation agreements that are the bedrock of a security relationship with the United States. India the Quad has been revived by Shinzo Abe and Narendra Modi. And India is a formal member of the Quad. And yes, we may pretend that the Quad is all about going to parties and going to picnics, but all of us know what the Quad is actually about. It's about ensuring a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, as Prime Minister Modi said at Shangri-La, which basically means you will not allow any country in the world to basically try and control the Indo-Pacific. India rejected American unipolarism. We paid a heavy economic price for that. We paid a heavy strategic cost for that. And may I say, in my view, the 1990s were a horrible decade. Bill Clinton was hell-bent on removing our nukes, removing our rockets, and making us completely defenseless against China. Bill Clinton was hell-bent on handing the Kashmir Valley to elements who would have immediately handed it over to the Pakistan military. So I don't remember the Clinton years. I don't remember my visits to Washington, my meetings at various offices in the US as particularly pleasant ones. They were not, because of this obsession of Clinton with the nuclear and space program of India and with Kashmir. Fortunately, that changed. I think George W. Bush deserves 99% of the credit for the nuclear deal. Condi Rice read the signals right. There were some, if I may say so, there were some individuals who were pretty negative about the initial nuclear deal that was going to be signed. I was one of them, Brahmachalani. There were others a few others who were very negative. And I think that helped Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to go back and say, look, I've got these guys here. They're calling me a traitor. They're saying all kinds of things. I've got to get much better terms from you. Ultimately, we got a deal that all of us can live with. So I'd like to also point
I'd
out,
like you
this
to
is
conclude
India.
this
No,
point. Yeah, so that
one
we
more
can,
minute. This
yeah,
is
okay.
India. This India, the Archaeological Survey of India, for 140 years, the 36% of the national monuments were the graveyards of British servicemen who died in India. Died, guess what? Died defending British colonialism in India. Well, those graveyards are going to be maintained in the future, but certainly 36% of our important national monuments are not graveyards anymore from 2021. The CRPC, the IPC, we're talking about the 1860s, and that has continued until Mr. Amit Shah, a day before, has basically said they're going to be scrapped. This is India. This is India of
That's
an
right.
oral tradition. We
All
believe in
right,
the oral
Mr.
tradition.
Napat,
We believe
I would have to,
in our word
yes,
of
request
honor.
you to wrap.
That
Maybe
is
we can
much
take it up
better
at a,
than anything
maybe we,
written. Thank you, Swati.
all right. I'm so sorry. Because I'm not really doing the most pleasant thing right now. I'm also, moderating the session, and the time is important. Well, yes, I think that was an important point. Uh, Before I come to General Chauhan, I think we would come back to it. We would revisit a lot of things in the question answer sessions as well. But one of the things is about that you mentioned about India and Russia having a rock solid relationship. Of course, it is, and one of the ways in which we balance one of our key elements of strategic autonomy is this multi alignment that India has, and I keep arguing that India's multi alignment is not an equal distribution. Of course, under the current strategic environment, it cannot be. So, the kind of so Quad is not equal to BRICS, it's not equal to SCO. So, it's not an equal distribution. Having said that, India's multi alignment is extremely important to India's worldview. And my worry is that you just mentioned a rock solid nature of the relationship. But we have to reckon to the fact that all the Ukraine war proceedings and the technological being cut off from the technological, elements and components and chips. I mean, Russia has really not been able to give us the remaining S-400s, and nobody believed that in India till the time the Indian Air Force actually slashed our procurement budget. So I think these are the kind of complexities that we are heading towards, and this is how when we're talking about weapons diversification, interoperability, technology, I think these are the kind of things which are really taking our time when we are doing all this research. So I mean, but that was a very important point that you brought out, that indeed Russia is very important for India's multi-alignment, and it will remain so. And I guess everybody that is our strategic partner today understands that really well. Now I'm coming to General Chauhan. I think he mentioned then that the relationship has not been easy, and there has been a trust factor. The trust factor, I mean, everybody has mentioned about the trust factor. I would really want to know from you, sir, and of course you are free to make your own observations, but I think I would like to know from you is that why? Because you have been in the army, and it really took 2013, 2014, 2017 Doklam, and then 2020 Galwan for India to become more proactive in its, China stance. So, if you could throw some light on that, we know that India and the US have signed foundational agreements starting from 2016, and those agreements have actually been tailored, specifically tailored for India's needs. So, whether it's the LEMOA or the COMCASA or BECA or ISA, and now all the strategic trade authorization that we have with the US, even like going some years back, how do you think this particular thing unfolding in how we manage the LAC and the China factor. That's one thing that I'd like to know from you. And the other thing that I'd like to know from you is that how do you perceive the lack of teeth that Quad has? Quad is often criticized for not having enough teeth to take on China. And out of all the members of the Quad, India perhaps is the only member that has really been very, very sensitive on that issue. So other members, even though they do not say the same in the Quad framework, but of course the security discourse has considerably changed in Japan. The security discourse has changed for Australia. I mean, they have their own things with China. They have security treaties with the US. So how do you perceive that, that lack of teeth? So these are my two specific areas that I would like you to focus on, but you are, of course, free to focus on what you find worthy. Thank you. General Chauhan, please. Sir, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati.
Yeah, we'll have to cut down it a little. So please be mindful of wrapping it within 5 minutes precisely.
Okay. Yeah, I will try and focus on the issues you want me to focus first. And then, of course, there will be no time for anything else. But let me tell you what are our concerns. We are absolutely clear about what US means to the world. We are absolutely clear that the voice of the United States is an important voice. It's a decisive voice. But where was our concern in the 1990s, in the 80s? Arun spoke about his gradation system of the 80s and the 90s. Uh, the issue was that we were at war with Pakistan. We felt the world was not understanding us. But at the same time, the US was also arming Pakistan and also arming, Taliban against the Russians. So that was our first issue of concern, that when we are talking about neighbors who are adversarial to us, why doesn't the US understand that they are adversaries, and why is the US still arming them? That was our first issue of concern, and that was something that whenever we spoke about it in various fora with the United States strategic community, we could not get them to understand that we were sensitive to the arming of Pakistan. We were sensitive to what was happening in Afghanistan. We were sensitive to the US engagement with China, because we were very clear from the very beginning that moment China rises, she will be a threat to us. And when we felt that the United States was not understanding our views, we automatically felt that, well, maybe the US is not serious to interact with us, and maybe the Russians understood. I've been also the strike corps commander of the Indian Army, one of the largest corps commanders. I mean, one of the largest corps of India, which is supposed to mandate it to go inside Pakistan. And I held this very massive exercise with the Russians in 2016. And at that moment, when the Russian generals came over to India and we were sitting down and talking, I found them much more sympathetic to our threat perception. This is something that I feel that the US has not understood about India's threat perceptions. We look to the west, we find Pakistan. We look to the north and the east, we find China. We have amongst us and within us fault lines, but also that these fault lines have been actually utilized by these two countries to create larger and larger problems for us. So this is the first issue. The second issue was of Asia. We are a large country, as Walter said, and as all of you have said, that India is a large country. We may have the largest population on earth. But more than that, it is the feeling that over the last 70, 75 years, why have you ignored us? Why have you ignored a country of the size of India? The strategic significance, as Walter said, absolutely. We're a peninsula that juts 1,800 kilometers into the Indian Ocean. You can't do without us. Any combination of any kind of war, less a conflagration in Europe, you need India. And we're a moderate country. And despite us being moderate, despite us being sensible, despite us not coveting someone else's territory, we still feel within our hearts that we're not being understood or we're being misunderstood. This is the first issue. The second issue, Swati, was about code. Now, in my senior years, I had the good fortune of visiting, along with my chief, in 2013. I visited Australia. I visited Israel. I visited Turkey. I visited the United States again, and a large number of other countries on our periphery that have, and of course, Japan. And when we were talking about the kind of size of their militaries, Swati, uh, the Australians have 100,000 people. I had 100,000 in my corps. India has 13 million people, 13 million soldiers in arms. We need those. And when we talk that we are an alliance with a country which has 100,000 soldiers, out of which 25,000 soldiers are at one time uh, in a rotation that Australia carries out between its army. At each time, there is just one division that is, operational, and the rest of the three divisions are not. Similarly, with Japan, you can plan any military alliance, but a military alliance also has to have an equality of the firepower, equality of people, equality of the burden that that particular military will carry. And when you try and see what Quad can do for us, can it keep China occupied in the Pacific? Can it keep it occupied in the Indian Ocean? The answer is very clear: no. Uh, so eventually, in any battle that we will, or any war that we have to fight, it would have to be only the US, because only the US has the ability to intervene within the Indian Ocean.
That's
It's not
right. Very
China,
strong.
it's not
Okay.
Japan, it's
Right.
not it's not Australia. They
Okay.
simply don't have the ability.
Right.
So
So we have
these
similar
two
questions from
issues, yeah.
the, yeah. So we have
Mm,
similar questions from the audience as well. So we can always elaborate on that.
yeah.
Now let me ask the third panelist, Mr. Arun Ayagari. And Arun, if you could just, I think nobody has touched on that. If you could elaborate a bit on the ISET, which is the critical elements, thing, the critical and emerging technologies deal that we've had with the US and its role in the military. You're a military man, and how does that work out?
Hi, thank you for the question. I know time is paucity of time, so I'll keep it very short to accommodate other viewers' questions. So you're right. So basically, ISAT, which stands for, as we all know, Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, was one of the initiatives which occurred as part of the deal between Mr. Modi and Mr. Biden when Modi visited U.S. last month, June 2023. I, I would like to focus more on, and there's also a transfer of technology as well, defense technology, which we've been waiting for quite some time. Although it's not 100%, it's about, I think, close to 80% transfer of technology. But there's something really sensitive in ICET, which is Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. Well, critical technology is something we should focus on because critical includes rare earth metals, rare earth elements, where currently China is a dominating state. Just to clarify, it's when people think when we talk about rare earth metals, people think they're called rare earth because they're rare. No, it's not because their availability, but because of the difficulty in extracting from the core, from the ore. Sorry, that's why they're rare, not because they're rare in availability. So this over reliance on China needs to be addressed, right? So which is why focusing on critical technology or rare earth metals is pretty paramount. If you can see, I think it's close to in 21. I think I'm not really sure about the number, but it's a significant percentage in terms of how dependent we are on China. Now coming to we were talking about the jets, right? The jet engines. No wonder that's a great achievement when there was a deal between HAL and General Atomic. So the only the downside of that, what I see is India really prepared? Are we advanced enough Sure, we'll get the center set up in India. There will be deals signed, but is India really prepared to have? Does India really have a workforce where we can handle that manufacturing or working on those technologies, especially for the fighter jet engines? So that is something, the F engines, F414, that is something I think we really need to focus on. We need to focus on that. Also brings to the core the importance of how much we're lagging in terms of semiconductor technology, because semiconductor technologies take a lot of water, to be honest, and that's water is a scarcity in India. So yeah, to sum it up, the transfer of technology is great, but I think we should ensure that we are ready in terms of manufacturing, in terms of assembling, in terms of workforce resources, human resources available to bring that to reality. Otherwise, it would just be for the namesake. So I can talk about this. The engines, the planes. I'm a pilot myself. Is my favorite topic. I go on and on and on. So, but I'll respect the time and I'll stop here.
Sure, thank you, Arun. That was really wonderful, and that you put it so like succinctly. Now, coming to Professor Anderson, I think one thing that is usually talked about, you brought it up again, and that's my specific interest also, is that about the trust factor. So often in India, there is this discourse of, you can't really rely on a country like America, because America has not really been, standing by India the same way as Russia perhaps does. So I think you did touch upon it, and because you have been so closely involved with all the background work that goes on in changing foreign policy, etc. I think I would like you to sort of elaborate more on the trust factor. Of course, it's changing, but is it stable enough? Or is it only got to do with the rise of China? I mean, of course, it is a catalyst. We all understand that that's where it's gravitating. But what are your views on that? And anything else that you might like to point out as well, Professor? But of course, please keep in mind the fact that we are running out of time. So, yes.
Right, I'll keep it short. The issue of trust is an interesting one. But I think you have to sort of, as you well know, what is foreign affairs all about? Foreign affairs is not a marriage. I think a point that Professor Nalapat brought up. It's a matter of interests, and it changes. Therefore, so to expect that a country is going to have a similar set of interests from 50 years ago to today is ridiculous. Countries move by interest. Interests change depending on the circumstances. It just so happens that now you have a situation in Asia where you have an aggressive China, in part incentivized by a growing economy and by an enhanced military. And so, we're responding to it, and India is responding to it, Australia is responding to it, Vietnam and other countries are responding. One of the, I think, major problems that the Chinese have done is to irritate all these countries, and they're starting to cooperate with each other. What is Quad all about? It's not purely a defensive, though defense is involved in Quad. AUKUS, what is that? Is purely defensive. And then there are other things. Several countries, including India, have increased their defense appropriations. And I think that's important. And what is that a reaction to? It's a reaction to the rise of China and the aggressiveness of China. I wanted to say something else, sort of go back to two comments that I think Professor Nalapat had raised, and that is China and Russia. The Chinese, I lived in China for several years, the Chinese have never been all that enamored by Russia, and vice versa, the Russians by China. Their relationship has been purely one of interests with each other, and I think that remains the case. This is not a marriage. It's not something that you have two cultures. It's not like us and, in a certain sense, India or us and the UK. The Chinese and the Russians have long had a strong dislike for each other. You're starting to see that again. If you look at the Chinese press is already beginning to question whether the Russians can stand up to the West, to NATO. And there are suggestions that it might not be. Now, don't forget, the Chinese press is controlled by the party. And the very fact this is getting into the press. The other thing is, somebody mentioned that they've had these peace agreements or peace talks, on Ukraine. The Chinese have attended those. And in those peace talks of them, they have actually been, I'm told, somewhat supportive of something that could end, the fighting that's taking place in Ukraine, because they realize it presents a real problem for the Chinese, long-range problem that they want to avoid. This is no longer a situation where they can sort of sit back and observe it calmly. They can't do it. The other thing I wanted to raise very briefly, someone had mentioned, so the Chinese, how are the Chinese themselves developing? I can tell you that when I was in China and I worked with students, the Chinese mindset is changing. Karl Marx would be horrified by China today. It is the last place in the world you'll feel real socialism. You have probably more capitalism in China than you have in the United States, in fact, in some ways, or in India, as a matter of fact. You have a whole, in fact, this has been somewhat concerned Xi Jinping, is what do you do with this large and growing China that's now accustomed to a much better lifestyle and travel? You've had 300,000 Chinese students in the US, and this has been true for the last several years. They, by and large, they've gone back, and they have had an influence on Chinese thinking. So I think what you have, and the other thing to change is Chinese becoming more traditional. Chinese, several of my students were going home during vacation to family shrines, which is a historic thing that the Chinese traditionally did. Extended families had a shrine, and at certain times of the year, they would go back to the shrine. I found my students doing that. And when asking them, well, what about all this communism? What did that do, you're thinking? They brushed it aside, as if somehow that was an epic that had more to do with strengthening China against the West and less to do with how the Chinese thought of themselves. So you're getting a different China. Now, what effect a more nationalist China has to do in relations, I'm not sure. One can argue both sides of that. But in terms of, a key thing with China and Russia, there is an element of suspicion and lack of trust between China and Russia. And as the Russians do badly, that will only grow, because the Chinese recognize, they're not stupid, they recognize that they really can't confront the US now. They can create problems, but beyond problems, they're not able to do so. And I think that, we have to play with that. We have to play on that, and the other thing is the Chinese respect strength. I taught, with international relations faculty, Chinese, and the one thing I kept hearing from them is that Chinese respect strength. And if a country, has the means, to resist, Chinese will hold off, which is one reason why there's a certain, what should I say, both admiration and fear of Modi. He's built up India's infrastructure. And the Indian military as well. And they see this as a potential constraint on China.
Right. All right, Professor Anderson, it's been really interesting. Now, you know what? We are really flooded by a lot of questions, and that's what we've been doing backstage, just trying to align the questions. For that, let me invite Shiv Kumarji. And Shiv Kumarji, you can start asking, some questions, introductory questions, and then we'll take it forward.
Sure. Thank you to all the panelists. It is no surprise that we are running so short of time. With the wealth of knowledge and experience that we have from the panelists and the amount of information that they can share across a wide range of topics, I'm not surprised that we're running short of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just push the couple of questions that we saw from the YouTube. This is from Vidya Sivakumar. Her question is about, with the wealth of knowledge that we have in this panel itself, with their engagement with the respective governments, how can that be leveraged to curb illegal assertions from the specific militant actors for China and Moscow? So anybody from the panel is more than welcome to take that question.
I can quickly start. I'll keep it very short so others can answer too. So this is kind of broad question. The first thing is recognizing the power of China, right? Number one. Number two, I'll keep it bulleted, quick and short. Number two, mounting international pressure. Number three, China is famous for pearl of strings strategy. India, in a way, it's not being highlighted, but it is following its own string of pearls, strategy by giving BrahMos missiles to one of the ASEAN states, and then working with I think Thailand, and there's even Vietnam. It's working with Vietnam as well. So it's designing its own string of pearls strategy. So sometimes you have to give it back to China in her own coin. That's number one. Number two would be putting global pressure to, and the last point is, I would say, diversify. De-risk, don't decouple, because that affects the whole global order. Do not decouple, de-risk and diversify your portfolio. That could be a strategic military arms portfolio. It could be a critical supply chain. Could be anything. Diversify. Yeah. So that's all I would say. There's a lot of other things, but I'll keep.
Yeah, Swati, I just want to make one point, and that is we cannot forget the nature of warfare practiced by China. As the general can tell you and others can tell you, Walter can say, the Chinese practice hybrid warfare. That means information warfare, disinformation warfare, and essentially it has meant using the internet to spread discourses that widen the fault lines in major democracies such as India and the US. So the try and empower the fringe groups and make them, in a sense, expand at the expense of the moderate middle. And we all know society needs a healthy, growing, moderate middle and a shrinking fringe. The Chinese want the opposite, especially in the big democracies like India and the US. And of course, a point I made, that S-400, I opposed the S-400 deal from the very beginning. I wrote against it. I went on TV against it precisely for this reason, that I forecast that there will be difficulties in supplying defense equipment to India in certain situations. But unfortunately, that has come to pass. But I was wrong on one thing, and frankly, the government of India was right. They said no sanctions are going to be put on India. I thought there would be sanctions. There were no sanctions. So I think I was right on warning about the S-400.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Nalapat and Arunji, for your valuable inputs. And I think in a multipolar world that we are looking at today, I think every party is responsible to take some moderate actions rather than taking an aggressive posturing, because indeed messaging is very, very important in a global world that is connected with social media. So with that, let us bring to the next question, that is from Mahesh. It says, with India taking a lead role in BRICS, the possibility of a new BRICS currency being introduced, which will accelerate the de-dollarization, I think it's a very common concern in everybody's mind today, both in India and US. Will it impact US-India relationship in the future?
Mahesh, just one minute my time. I'm a Malayali. For us, 5 minutes is torture. 50 minutes is being unreasonable. But anyway, the fact is the Chinese want to use this BRICS currency idea to make the RMB the currency of the BRICS countries and a wider spectrum. They don't want to see the Indian rupee. They don't want the South African rand. They don't want the Brazilian real. They want only the RMB, not even the ruble. So the BRICS currency is not going to take off because the Chinese are not serious about it. They're only serious about their own currency.
Can I add to that? There's another issue involved here, and none of us have referred to it, and that's the banking system. It's the banking systems that control the movement of money. The banking systems now, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, it's 95% dollars. Is that going to change? I doubt it. It'll only change if other countries, build up their economies significantly, because most of the world now is accustomed to dealing with dollars. My wife is an Indian, by the way. She has a business in a factory. She manufactures clothes she sells here. When she sends money back to India, she does it through banks that only deal with dollars. What would they do? She once asked if they would take rupees, and they laughed in her face. No. Would they take, because I had some Chinese currency I had built up, would they take that? No, they wouldn't. They would take one currency, the dollar. I don't see that changing.
Yeah, thank you both. And Dr. Swasti, over to you again for the subsequent questions.
That's right. Thank you. So we'll just try to, what we have done is that we have tried to club together a lot of similar questions because so that they can be taken together. So for example, one of the things that would interest a lot of Indians, and which is that if US continues to support Pakistan, how will it impact this partnership? Anybody can take this up. Anybody of you here? Yeah.
Can I start? The U.S. is not supporting Pakistan. Here again, read the Pakistani press if you have any doubt about that. There are all sorts of ways that they think that we should have helped them in one way or the other, and we're not. And when Modi was here, there was some questions that were asked him that addressed that, and Biden and Blinken both kind of ignored that, pressed it aside, because what's important to the U.S. now is a good relationship with India. Interests. The U.S. had an interest 30 years ago of having a relationship with Pakistan, and one has to recognize that. And it now, it may get an interest again, depending on how the Taliban, whether they get international in their orientation. So far, they haven't because of internal problems. But Pakistan, you barely read about Pakistan in the U.S. press anymore. You know, it's an issue that it doesn't cross people's minds. Look at when Modi visited, the various speeches they gave back and forth. There was, I don't recall a single mention of Pakistan in any of those talks. So we have to keep in mind, what is international relations? It's based on interests, and interests change. And we had an interest 30 years ago, which we don't have today. You know,
Right.
so it's
Right. All
Also,
right.
also, India has grown out of our Pakistan bogey. Pakistan is no longer an issue with us. Uh, it's way behind in our list of priorities, and we can deal with the US dealing with Pakistan because we know that 30 years ago you tried to balance relationship with both of us. Now there's no question. You know the truth. It's absolutely clear in your face that Pakistan is no match for India. It'll never be, and it'll only sink further. So we are quite clear that do what you want with Pakistan. It makes no difference to us. We have a resurging China to deal with, and for that we need you guys. And as you said, foreign relations or any international relations are a need-based situation, and you need us and we need you. I think that's the start of a very mature relationship. Whether it's an arranged marriage or a relationship, doesn't matter. But
Right.
we're,
Right.
we're, good. We're fine with that. We're absolutely fine with you guys doing anything in Pakistan because I don't think it matters anymore to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. I brought in Pakistan because I guess it was missing out and a lot of people would be interested. The second question we have here, and we had similar questions, we have tried to club it. So, like, your opinion and the panelists here. So, do you believe that the US and India have discussed the short term and long term impact of the proximity of Russia and China? Or is there anything that you would like to add to it after whatever you've already discussed?
Well,
do you,
sorry. Yeah, I'd just like to point out that the manner in which the US has focused on Ukraine and on the Ukraine war, and the way in which it has flooded Ukraine with weapons, uh, really in stark contrast to the weapons given to Taiwan, to the fact that whether it's India or Taiwan, weapons are given at top dollar. To the Ukrainians, it's effectively given free of cost. And there is a perception that that's because Ukraine is a European country and the US is partial to European countries. And Europe, of course, naturally is partial to European countries, but we don't see the US as a European country. The US has got all different cultures: Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe. So, frankly, the soft power and the influence of the United States, as well as the trust factor of the United States, is severely depleted as a consequence of the stark difference between the flow of weapons to Ukraine and the terms on which they've been offered, and the flow of weapons to the largest democracy in the world, India, which is directly facing China, as the general correctly said, and losing lives in the process, taking lives as well, and Taiwan, which is being its sea space, its airspace, and possibly its land space, and certainly a lot of its cyberspace has already been encroached by China. And what is the US doing about it compared to what it's doing in Ukraine? So I'm sorry to say we have gone back to 50, 55 years ago when the perception was the US is only interested in Europe and not any other continent. I'm afraid the Ukraine war has had that particular cost to the US, to the US soft power in this part of the world.
Yeah, very quickly, I would like to add one thing to what Swasti said. It's great you're thinking about Russia and China. I would also like to add Russia, Iran, and China. I think that is the axis which the question should involve, only because I personally feel West Asia is the heart of the world. Anything which happens in West Asia is the most direct way for a person to see the impact. All they have to do is, if there's an instability in West Asia, they have to go try to pump gas in their car or vehicle, and they'll see that the gas price rise. So that is something. And another thing on Iran is, this is exactly why the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, needs to be passed. It is really important for America and rest of the world that the JCPOA comes to fruition. That's all I would like to add. Thank you.
So very quickly, just the last question, because it was something else, which is that how do you think that this partnership, which is India-US partnership, is going to get Global South the kind of attention and benefit that the Global South has been asking for?
I think the very yeah. Please go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment. So I think the very fact that U.S. is assigning so much importance to India, be it part of the climate deal discussions or otherwise, I think that in itself is a fact that the Global South is gaining prominence, and again, attributing to the fact that the whole world is multipolar and pluralistic in nature, that itself is putting Global South in the pedestal. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Nalapat, go ahead.
No, look, about Iran, we have used Iran as a land bridge to Central Asia, which long-term US ally Pakistan has been denying us for so long. Today, Pakistan is effectively the Chinese sphere of influence. It's no longer in the US sphere of influence, but that's the first point. And the second point is, we have been a country, right, which has faced a huge amount of problems as a consequence of Wahhabi terror. We don't want a second front of Khomeini's terror as well, which is inevitable if we have a broken down relationship with Iran, quite frankly. So let me say, for India, Iran is important for these two reasons: as a land bridge and to prevent two fronts in the war on terror, which would be the situation. The only country unfortunate enough to face that second Khomeinist front and to bear the brunt of it bravely is Israel. And we love Israel, but I would only like to say we don't want to go in the footsteps of Israel, and we are very careful about Iran. So I just like to make that
just to quickly disagree with that is, you're right. Initially, we had the bridge with Iran, and we are trying to build a Chabahar port and all that, but we gave in to Donald Trump's pressure, and we cut our ties with Iran. So we are not as in friendly terms as much as we should be. That's all.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean that we cut our ties with Iran. For some time, we stopped buying Iranian oil, and if you again check that is a mistake. But we have not cut our ties with Iran. Our ministers have gone there.
Sorry, I meant oil, not the entire bilateral relation, but I meant oil. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Which I think is no longer cut.
In fact, it is because of India's constant support to Iran that Iran this year became a permanent member of the SCO. Exactly. So that's there. Anyway, so I would like to now take things back and again play the role of the moderator and thank all of you here. But before I call Shiv Kumarji for the formal vote of thanks, let me just say that I thoroughly enjoyed moderating this really wonderful panel, and there are still so many questions left, but maybe that's again for some other time, some other panel. So Shiv Kumarji, would you please like to come and extend the formal vote of thanks?
Sure. I am short of words, Dr. Swasti and the panelists. First of all, sincere thanks to the participants and for the whole bunch of questions that they have put it out there. Unfortunately, we have not been able to take some of the questions, but Dr. Swasti did a phenomenal job in trying to combine similar type of questions to get the panelists' opinion. I sincerely would like to thank you for the wonderful job that you did today, moderating it. It was not easy to moderate such a high-powered panel. My next thanks is to each one of you, Professor Nalapat, Lieutenant General Shokin Chauhan, Mr. Arun Ayagari, and Dr. Walter Anderson. Thank you so much for taking time out on a Saturday morning, Saturday evening in India, and being a part of this panel. We are truly honored. But I'm not going to let you go without your commitment, based on all the interest that I'm seeing it from the chat, that you will come back. Probably we will have a much more specific topic, and then we will hash it out in a series of such debates in future. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to AIPF for organizing this, and the
Thank you.
moderator and Kumar. You guys did a great
There
job.
is a lady by name Rasita ji, that she's in the backstage, and
Yep.
she's quietly doing a
Yes,
lot of
she
work.
is.
We owe sincere thanks to her as
Yeah,
well.
Kumar,
She did a
Swasti, and
fabulous
Rasita.
job. Yes.
And AIPF. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.